Prince Alexander of Westmere sat alone in his Montecito study, surrounded by shelves of unopened books and the quiet hum of California evening. Outside, the coastal fog rolled over the hills like slow-moving ghosts, but his mind was thousands of miles away in the cold, gray corridors of Aldenhall Palace. It had been nearly a year since he'd spoken directly to his father, King Edward IV. The rift between them, once a crack, had widened into a chasm. And now, with his children growing older and his exile beginning to feel more permanent, Alexander felt the ache of distance sharpen into something heavier. Something that felt like regret. He reached for a pen, a fountain pen gifted to him by his late mother, and pulled a crisp sheet of thick cream paper from the drawer. His hand hesitated before the ink touched the page. Pride had kept him from writing for so long. Pride and perhaps fear. But that night, the silence in his home was louder than the noise of any headline or scandal. So he wrote. Slowly, deliberately, avoiding the ornate language of his upbringing, he asked to meet, just the two of them. No press, no protocol, no retinues. Only father and son, in private. The letter, folded carefully and sealed with the personal crest unused since his royal resignation, was delivered discreetly through a mutual contact, Sir Thomas Everwick, the king's long-trusted private secretary. Sir Thomas had once been fond of Alexander and hesitated when he saw the envelope. He recognized the handwriting instantly, traced with a familiar mixture of care and urgency. When the letter finally reached King Edward, he was in his private study, sipping tea beside the fireplace, a thick dossier of parliamentary briefings unopened on his lap. Upon seeing the envelope, the king's expression did not change, but he placed the briefing aside and opened it without pause. He read it once, then again, his brow furrowing ever so slightly at the final line. There was no apology, no dramatic confession, just a simple statement about missing the closeness they once shared. Rather than respond, the king tucked the letter into the top drawer of his desk. For 3 days it remained there. He did not speak of it to the Queen, nor to Lionel, the Crown Prince. During those days, Edward would occasionally open the drawer, read the letter again, then close it. Each time, he lingered a little longer, caught between the sovereign he had become and the father he had tried, perhaps imperfectly, to be. Meanwhile, in Montecito, Alexander waited. Not with hope, but with a quiet stillness that only comes when someone has given all they can. Back in Montecito, the air carried a stillness that wasn't peaceful. Prince Alexander had grown restless after sending the letter. Each morning, he lingered by the window of the sunlit hallway, eyes scanning the Pacific horizon, though he wasn't really looking at anything. He had expected something by now. A message, a call, even a polite rejection. But silence stretched like a thread pulled too tight. It was in that silence that the tension between him and Marla began to stir again. Marla Hayes had been watching Alexander closely, noticing the way his shoulders slumped more each day. She could sense it, the ache he tried to hide, the subtle glances toward the framed photo of his father that he hadn't removed, though it no longer sat on display. She didn't ask about the letter at first. She already knew he had sent it. Instead, she waited, watching him circle the topic like a wounded animal unsure of where it was bleeding. Then, during one late afternoon, when Alexander had spent hours in the garden pruning plants he didn't care about, she finally approached him, not with accusation, but with caution. She wanted to know what he hoped to gain. When he avoided the question, she pressed further. She reminded him of the past, the public scrutiny, the private slights, the carefully veiled rejections that came dressed in royal politeness but stung all the same. She couldn't understand how, after everything, he still longed for the approval of a place that had barely tolerated them. Alexander didn't respond right away. He walked away from the garden, hands trembling slightly. Later that evening, he sat alone in the kitchen with a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. He couldn't explain it to her that yearning wasn't about titles or duty anymore. It was about a father who used to call him my boy and a home that now felt unreachable. Meanwhile, at Eldenhull, King Edward stood before his study window with the letter once again in hand. For hours he had been silent. Sir Thomas, ever discreet, entered with his evening dispatch and noticed the king's gaze fixed far beyond the palace lawns. There was no instruction about a reply, no acknowledgement of the letter's contents. Instead, Edward turned to the fireplace and fed the coals with a long iron poker, as if trying to stoke something within himself. Elsewhere in the palace, Prince Lionel had caught wind of the letter. He spoke to no one directly, but made it known through subtle conversation with advisers that any attempt at reconciliation would be seen as weakness, especially with Marla involved. He had never hidden his contempt for her. He believed she had stolen Alexander, not just from the family, but from the crown, and so the silence remained, a heavy presence in both worlds. In Montecito, it drove a wedge between husband and wife. In Eldenhull, it stirred suspicion behind polished doors. Marla grew increasingly guarded, convinced that if an invitation came, it would come with conditions or worse, with insult disguised as civility. She made it clear through her demeanor and tone that she would not return to that world. Not again. Not even for Alexander. Alexander, caught in the middle, began to realize that the letter had been only the first step. The real conflict wasn't between him and the king. It was between the life he had chosen and the past that refused to fully let him go. A fortnight after the letter had been sent, a quiet reply finally arrived at the Montecito estate. It came not as a formal summons, but through a discreet channel, hand-delivered by a trusted courier from the British consulate. There was no royal seal, no crest, just a folded note with the king's signature at the bottom. It was an invitation. A private meeting between father and son to take place in the secluded rose garden of Eldenhull. No aides, no press. And most notably, no mention of Marla. When Alexander read it, his heart pulsed with something between hope and dread. For a moment, he simply stared at the parchment. Then he stood up, crossed the room, and placed the note beside the family photo on the mantel. He didn't tell Marla immediately. Instead, he spent the rest of the day in quiet thought, walking through the eucalyptus trees behind their home, each step a meditation on what he might say, and what he might have to leave unsaid. 2 days later, he boarded a discreet flight to London alone. He wore no insignia, no sign of royal association, just a navy coat, a wool scarf, and an expression carved from restraint. The drive to Eldenhull was long and mostly silent. Upon arrival, no ceremony greeted him. A steward led him through a back entrance, down a familiar corridor once lined with portraits of monarchs past, now partially veiled for restoration. The walled rose garden was just as he remembered, solemn and eternal in its stillness. King Edward stood beneath the sprawling oak in the center, cane in hand, wrapped in a dark green overcoat. His hair had gone more silver than Alexander remembered, and his posture was more stooped than the statuesque figure preserved in newspapers. Still, he carried himself like a monarch, steady and unyielding. Alexander approached with measured steps, offering a shallow nod. His father didn't return the gesture immediately. Instead, he looked at his son with unreadable eyes, as though trying to measure the weight of years past in a single glance. Then he turned and gestured toward a nearby bench, not with words, but with a simple shift of the hand. They sat. The conversation began slowly, like two men unlearning how to speak to one another. The king asked about the children. Alexander gave brief but heartfelt answers. He spoke of his son's interest in nature, his daughter's growing curiosity for storytelling, He watched as the king nodded politely, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance, not quite on Alexander, but not entirely away either. Edward made no inquiry about Marla, not once. Alexander noticed, of course, but said nothing. Instead, he brought up his charity work, his involvement with mental health initiatives, his recent veteran outreach efforts. The king responded with vague acknowledgement, offering little in return. The absence of warmth was palpable. At one point, Alexander mentioned the garden, how he used to run through it as a child, how he once climbed the very oak under which they now sat and scraped his knee on the bark. Edward's lips curled into something that resembled a smile, but it vanished as quickly as it came. 20-7 minutes passed. Then the king stood. No farewell, no handshake. Just a nod, the kind a monarch gives when closing a meeting. Alexander rose as well, but before he could speak again, Edward had already turned toward the corridor. Left alone, Alexander lingered in the garden. The roses were beginning to wither in the chill of the late season. He looked up at the branches of the oak and remembered a time when things felt simpler, before titles, before resentment, before love had become a battlefield between bloodlines. By the time he was escorted out, the sun had dipped behind the palace, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Alexander didn't look back. He knew then that the door hadn't opened, it had merely creaked, and behind it, trust remained locked away. When Prince Alexander returned to Montecito, the quiet that greeted him was heavier than the one he had left behind. The sun shone as always, casting golden rays across the terracotta tiles of their estate, but something in the air felt shifted. Marla met him at the front entrance, arms folded across her chest. She didn't ask what happened. Not immediately. She could already read the answer in the tension across his face, in the tired slump of his shoulders, in the silence that trailed behind him like a shadow. He set down his coat and walked past her, heading straight to the back patio where the sea breeze drifted in soft waves through the open doors. There, he sat for a long time without speaking. Marla eventually followed, taking a seat opposite him. He glanced at her only briefly, as if to signal that he had nothing triumphant to share. Later that night, as they sat in the living room beneath the soft hum of a distant jazz record, he told her everything. He described the garden, the oak tree, the brief exchange with his father. The way the king's face remained impassive, how the bench they sat on felt like neutral ground in a battlefield that had never truly declared peace. He recounted how the meeting ended without a proper goodbye. No embrace, no reconciliation, just a nod and a turning away. Marla listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, but her hands tightened slowly and her lap. Days passed. The press had not yet learned of the meeting, but whispers began to swirl from within the palace. Some of the king's aides had spoken quietly to select courtiers, who then shared with favored journalists in hushed tones at private dinners and afternoon teas. A particular phrase began to emerge from those exchanges, that the king had tried to extend an olive branch, but that Marla remained the barrier. It didn't take long for that suggestion to take form in the media. She isn't trusted. Alexander read those words in a headline one morning and froze. He didn't show the article to Marla. She found it herself later that day. When she did, she didn't raise her voice or break into fury. She simply walked into the garden and remained there until sunset. Alexander watched her from the window, unsure whether to follow or let her be. He chose silence. As the days turned to weeks, the atmosphere between them became more strained. Marla returned to her work, throwing herself into meetings and calls with her foundation team, while Alexander became withdrawn. He began spending hours in his study, revisiting old journals, reading childhood letters from his mother, as if trying to remember a version of himself that no longer existed. Then came the final blow. an envelope from Eldenhall, delivered by private courier. Inside was an invitation to the king's annual Christmas gathering. It was addressed solely to Prince Alexander of Westmere. No mention of Marla. No indication of welcome for the woman he had chosen to share his life with. He read it twice, then folded it quietly and placed it in the same drawer where his father's response to the original letter now sat. He closed the drawer without a word. On Christmas morning, while the world watched televised scenes of the royal family attending church in their polished coats and ceremonial hats, Alexander remained in Montecito. He took his children to the beach. He laughed with them, helped them build sandcastles, and tried to forget the weight of what wasn't. Sighed, but inside, he carried the sting of that cold echo, a conversation that had promised so much but delivered only silence in a different form.